Again, thank you for coming, for joining us. Slavery in Australia. Who has heard about slavery in Australia? So that's why it's very interesting, and Sister Noelene here will share with us her experience. She's been with ACRAT, the Australian Catholic Religious Against Trafficking in Humans. She's been with ACRAT for 10 years, and she's been traveling overseas to Rome, Thailand especially, to really exchange ideas, experiences on how they can control the human trafficking. So without further delay, I'm gonna give the floor to Sister Noelene.
Thanks very much, Maria. And I'd like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to those people and thank them for their care of the earth. I'd also like to thank Father Bob and Maria for inviting me and for the encouragement that they've given me in presenting to you this afternoon. It's an issue that I feel very, very passionate about, but I also think it's wonderful that you're here because you could be doing so many other things on this long weekend on a beautiful day in Sydney. So your presence here inspires me too, so thank you very much. So as we've said, the topic for this afternoon is, in Australia, slavery. And unfortunately, that is a reality, that slavery does exist in Australia. And as Maria mentioned to you, I belong to an organisation called ACRAT, Australian Catholic Religious Against Trafficking in Humans. I've been a member of ACRAT now for 10 years, but ACRAT actually began in 2005, a group of congregations of women religious responding to a global call to work against human trafficking, especially that of women and children, got together and started ACRAT. Today, ACRAT is spread throughout Australia, and its members comprise religious sisters, religious brothers, religious priests and diocesan priests and lay people. And it's wonderful that we are able to work together and collaborate together on this issue. I think often we get our energy from each other when we're getting a little bit despondent about what's not happening fast enough. Somebody else will be able to see the hope in it, and together we're able to really keep up our energy and work together. So let's have a look at the issue of human trafficking. And some of you may know some of this, so I apologise if it's material that you already know. But human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes in our world. It has overtaken the arms race, and it's close to overtaking the drug trade. Unfortunately, it's far easier to get human beings across country borders than it is to transport drugs across country borders. And so that makes it so much easier for human traffickers. The statistics, and in a sense I don't like bringing this down to statistics because it is about human beings. It's human beings whose lives are interrupted. But globally, there is an estimate that has been put forward by the Global Slavery Index and the International Labour Organisation that there are roughly 40 million people enslaved in our world today. That number could be the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of people who experience this crime that do not come forward, and I'll explain later why that could be the case. Of those people who are trafficked and enslaved, the larger percentage are women and girls, and that's estimated to be roughly 80% are women and girls. So that just gives you some idea of the magnitude of this crime. It's only a glimpse into the magnitude of this crime. So how do we define what human trafficking is? And we take our definition from a UN protocol that is a protocol put in place to work against this very transnational crime. And in the definition, there are 3 elements. The first is that it is a process of obtaining people, of moving people, of holding people or harbouring them, and moving them through diverse routes in order to get to a destination. And the means by which people are obtained is by force, by kidnapping, by deception, by fraudulent means, coercion, building people's dreams up of a better life, but really deceiving those people. And what really happens is that when the people arrive at their destination, the dreams that they had are shattered, and instead they find themselves in involuntary servitude. They can find themselves in debt bondage, where they have to work so many hours and earn so much money for their captors before they can be released. Forms of slavery, sexual exploitation, and many others. So the only ones who benefit from this process are the traffickers themselves. And the International Labour Organisation estimates that collectively traffickers earn about $150 billion a year. So it's a very lucrative trade, that of buying and selling people. So the face of modern slavery. There are a number of crimes, as we alluded to in that previous slide. Children are very vulnerable, sex trafficking, child soldiers, children forced into doing hazardous work that is detrimental to their health. Forced marriage. Forced marriage is a crime. It's part of the criminal legislation of Australia since 2013. It is not the same as an arranged marriage. In arranged marriages, the parties, the future husband and wife, have a choice. In a forced marriage, there is no choice. One or both parties can be forced into it. And as I said, forced marriage has been a crime in Australia since 2013. At the time that that crime was added to the criminal code, Nicola Roxon was the Attorney General of Australia, and she said that she hoped that there'd never be a conviction under that legislation, but that this legislation would send out a message to try and prevent forced marriages from happening in Australia. But unfortunately, that's not the case. There haven't been any convictions under that law, but there have been convictions under similar laws about the exploitation of people through marriage. So as you can see, there are a number of, and they're just a scattering. There are lots more that we could add to that list that's on the board there. So people who are being trafficked can find themselves in a number of different industries. And when we list these industries, we're not saying that all of those industries are corrupt. What we're saying is that there are some people operating in those industries who are corrupt and exploiting other people. So the hospitality and agricultural industries, people who are working in cafes and restaurants around this very city even, can be experiencing exploitation and slavery. The agricultural industry in Australia, some of the food that we're purchasing in our supermarkets is tainted by slavery. Domestic servitude, women working in homes where their freedom is limited and they have to work long hours, unreasonable hours each day. The construction industry, people are looking for cheap labour in order to be able to make greater profits. The mining industry, particularly children in the mining industry, we're not aware of in Australia, children being in forced labour in mines, but it certainly happens in other countries. And the minerals that those children are mining can often be in our electronic equipment, in our jewellery, in our cosmetics, in a number of different places. So we don't realise it, but by the goods that we're purchasing, we can sometimes be fuelling the demand for slaves. And of course, sexual exploitation and the pornography industry are other situations. So why are we concerned about this? Well, as we know from our gospel, Jesus said, "I have come that all may have life and have it to the full." And as people committed to following Jesus, that is our mission too, to ensure that people around us and people even that we don't know do have fullness of life. It's a very tall order, but if we all collaborate and work together, we can make a difference in the lives of other people, and we can work towards fulfilling Jesus and God's desire for all of us. In addition to what comes to us through our Christian tradition, we have the civil tradition. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948. And Article 4, so very high up in the list, Article 4 said, "No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and servitude shall be prohibited in all their forms." And of course, many people think, well, we had slavery in centuries gone by with the transatlantic slave period, but William Wilberforce in England and Abraham Lincoln in America, they worked against this, and we don't have slavery anymore. Well, sadly, that is not the case. Another person who inspires us, particularly these days, is Pope Francis. Both before he became Pope and as Pope, this has been an issue that has really touched his heart. He's often spoken about it, and he's set up organisations and encouraged organisations in working against this crime. And in 2014, he said, "It is not possible to remain indifferent before the knowledge that people, human beings, are bought and sold like goods." Strong words. And as I said, it's not just words from Pope Francis. He certainly has been meeting with lots of groups, trying to encourage law enforcement, teachers, youth, medical people, trying to encourage them to be alert to this and to do what they can to work against it. He actually often uses the phrase that this is a crime against humanity. So we can be inspired by our gospel tradition, by our civil lawmakers, and also by our leaders of today, especially Pope Francis. So when we come to Australia, when I first started with ACRAF, and people said to me, now that you've moved out of school, what are you doing? And I'd say working against human trafficking. Oh, but that doesn't happen in Australia. And we all think it happens in some other country. We tend to think it happens only in developing countries. But unfortunately, no country in our world is exempt. It happens in every country. It exists here in Australia, here in Sydney. Australia does have strong legislation against human trafficking and slavery. However, to date, there have been very few convictions of human trafficking here in Australia. And so the numbers that we're seeing are, again, only the tip of the iceberg. One of the reasons for that is a number of people who are trafficked into Australia, they come from countries where they can't trust law enforcement. We're aware of people in other countries that were trafficked, went to law enforcement for help, and were resold again by law enforcement. So, here in Australia, they don't realise that law enforcement is not the same as it is in their country. And the only way in Australia to get government support for a person who's trafficked is to actually talk to the Australian Federal Police. So that is a barrier to being supported through this crime. There are a number of NGOs such as ACRAF and Anti-Slavery Australia, Salvation Army, they're just a few, quite a number of groups that do support victims, but they can't tap into the government-aided Support for Trafficked People program unless they talk to the Federal Police. So we might just have a look at a couple of cases that have been reported in the mainstream media, just to give you an idea of what is happening in Australia. And the first case is one of domestic servitude. This Four Corners report is still available on the Four Corners website, and it is about a woman who was in domestic servitude, working long hours, not allowed to leave the house, having to provide sexual services to anyone who approached her. She was lucky enough to escape and really wanted to raise awareness so that others would not have to experience exactly the same as what she'd been through. This is a case of an Indian cook in a restaurant in Earlwood. He came to Australia thinking he was going to have a wonderful job with great income, be able to map out a great life for himself. Instead, in the restaurant, he was forced to work all day and then locked in the storeroom at night with a bucket of water. No salary. His passport had been taken from him and therefore his visa. And eventually he was able to escape and it went through court. He was awarded over $200,000 that was owed to him in back pay. And the owner of the restaurant was given a custodial sentence. I can't remember how many years that person was convicted for. A more recent conviction was in 2019, April of last year, and this was the first Australian conviction against forced labour. And it was a Brisbane couple who were of Polynesian origin. They brought in a woman from Fiji and they forced her to do domestic servitude in their home, looking after their children, working in their business, housework, dusk till dawn, dawn till dusk. She was paid roughly $150 to $250 a fortnight. Her passport was held and eventually her visa expired, so she became an illegal citizen because she was still being held captive. And that's something that they had hold over her with then, that if she escaped from them, she would be illegal, in strife with law, and be deported. So we don't need the metal chains that may have been used in bygone eras of slavery. It's a lot of psychological chains that people use now to hold people captive. Fortunately, this woman was able to escape and get help, and last year, as you can see from that heading, the couple were convicted. They were given a jail sentence. The wife of the couple was convicted for trafficking because she was the one held responsible for bringing the woman into Australia, and also for slavery, and so she was given a sentence of 6 years. The husband was only convicted of slavery and he was given a sentence of 5 years. And their non-parole period is only 2 years. So it's not very long and they're out free, able to do this again if they can find a means to do so. The case that is a more current one is the case of 22 men from Vanuatu. I say current because it's still going on. Not that they're still in slavery, but the outcome of that slavery is still in process. They came to Australia in 2014 under the Pacific Island Seasonal Workers Program. a government aid program to help people in Pacific countries. Before they arrived in Australia, the labour hire firm that recruited them said that they had to send their airfares ahead and also send ahead some money so that when they arrived, that money could be given to them for their incidental expenses. Under that program, it's illegal for them to have to pay their airfare up front, and the program only provides for a percentage of the airfare to be recouped by the labour hire firm over a period of time. However, when the men arrived in Australia in 2014, they were not given their spending money that they'd sent ahead. They were put to work on farms up in the Bundaberg, Childers, Lockyer Valley area, mainly tomato farms. That was the only food they were given, the tomatoes they were picking, and they were housed in slave-like conditions. Eventually, they went home, most of them with no money at all. A couple of them were given $50. That was after about 6 or 7 months of work. Eventually, their case became known by ACRAF and some other NGOs in Australia because a couple of the men came back through another labour hire firm. And we've been working with the men since then. They were told that they could take their case to the Fair Work Ombudsman, and the Fair Work Ombudsman did take up the case and it went to court in 2015. The judge of that court case, Judge Michael Jarrett, said it was the most egregious form of labour exploitation he had ever come across. The men, because it went through just the Fair Work courts, it wasn't a criminal court that it went through, it was the Brisbane Circuit Court. So the men, the labour hire firm and also the director of the labour hire firm were both given fines. They really owed the men over $77,000 in back pay, and they were told that they had to pay that. However, to this day, the men have not received 1 cent. Last year, some of our members were successful in having the cases, enforcement cases heard in the Brisbane Circuit Court, and the director of the labour hire firm appeared 6 times between June and December. And in the end, the court realised they were not going to get a cent out of this man, so the case was closed. No conviction because it wasn't in a criminal court. So there's not a lot of hope for those men. But we have been working with members of Parliament and other groups. We have Father, I can't think of his name at the moment, one of our Columban members, Peter O'Neill. Father Peter O'Neill has been working very closely with a number of groups, trying to get this case before the Australian government, because we believe the Australian government is morally culpable. Has some culpability because it was an Australian aid program, and we're trying to get an ex gratia payment for these men. We've got a law firm in Queensland that is prepared to do pro bono work with us. We've had a number of letter writing campaigns over a period of time, but at the moment we're working directly through to the Department of Finance and the Department of Prime Minister, trying to get an outcome for these men. These men came thinking they were going to be able to earn money and support their families back home, but instead went home actually in debt because of the money they'd borrowed to come here in the first place. So that's just a snapshot of a few cases. Now, often when I give these kinds of presentations in schools, after I've talked about a number of cases, I'll often stop and just say to people and the students, what's happening inside you at the moment? This is pretty confronting information about the way human beings have been treated. And we can have a number of reactions to that. And the reactions can be, well, it's somebody else, I don't have to worry about it, I don't know these people. Or the reaction can be, these are my brothers and sisters that this is happening to. how can I do something to help? And we can then come into a sense of helplessness. So later on in the presentation, I will give you some suggestions of things that you might be able to do to help. As I said earlier, in Australia, in order for the crime to be recognised, there has to be communication with the Australian Federal Police. And on the 30th of July, which is the International Day Against Human Trafficking and Slavery, the Australian Federal Police released statistics for the 2019-2020 financial year. They actually had 223 referrals in that 12-month period. Of those referrals, 92 were for forced marriage. Around that same time that they released these figures, there was an item on the Channel 7 News one night about slavery in Australia, and the Federal Police were involved in that presentation. And they indicated that of those 92 forced marriage referrals, one of them was an 8-year-old boy who was being forced into a marriage. So it does impact males and females and people of all ages. Now, as you know, it's a crime in Australia to force anyone into marriage. And even if a person is choosing to get married, they should be 18 or over, or if one person is between 16 and 18 and a magistrate gives approval, then the wedding can go ahead. But that's when the two people are agreeing to the marriage. These forced marriage cases are where people are not agreeing to the marriage. 40 cases of sexual servitude, 29 cases of forced labour, 32 were for trafficking in persons, and of those 32, 4 were children who'd been trafficked into Australia. And then there were other crimes of debt bondage and coercion, because they're crimes in our criminal law too. So again, confronting information. So how is the international community dealing with this crime? Well, back in 2000, the United Nations set up a convention that was accepted by the General Assembly, and it's a very long title. It's the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, supplementing the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime. Now, it's a long name. That's why we tend to refer to it as the Palermo Protocol, because the document was actually signed in the Italian city of Palermo. So that was the year that it was accepted by the United Nations General Assembly. Now, in order to sign and accept that in any country, the country has to be prepared to ratify it through their laws and through their practices in the country. So it took a couple of years before countries started to sign it. But fortunately, Australia was amongst the first group of countries, and in 2003 we were one of 115 countries that signed that protocol. Because we signed that protocol, our country, and we as citizens of our country, have 3 responsibilities. There's a responsibility to try and prevent human trafficking and slavery, and that is done by raising awareness, by establishing laws that send a message. Then the second responsibility is to prosecute people who have been trafficking others and exploiting others. And thirdly, there's a responsibility to protect people who have been trafficked into Australia. And earlier on, I did mention the Australian Government Support for Trafficked People program. The government finances that program. It is run by the Red Cross, but as I said before, only people who are prepared to speak to the Australian Federal Police can be put on that program. The Australian Federal Police refer them to the Red Cross. Over the years, there has been improvement in Australia in the way that we try to protect victims of human trafficking and slavery. When I first started working with ACRAF, a person who was acknowledged to be a victim of human trafficking and slavery by the Australian Federal Police, if they needed to be put onto a visa so they could stay in Australia, because many of the traffickers take visas and passports, they were put onto what was called a criminal justice stay visa, which was the same visa that criminals were put onto. Through the work of ACRAF and other NGOs, we were able to get that changed, and now the visa that human trafficking victims are put onto is called a Bridging F visa. And because it's a visa only for people who've experienced this, then there can be services attached to that visa so that people can be supported while they stay in Australia. Access to Medicare and so on, things that will help them. And also the permanent visa, if it's considered that it's too dangerous for the person to go back to their own country, they can be given a permanent visa. It used to be called Witness Protection Permanent Trafficking Visa, and of course that stigmatises the person for life. It's now called a Referred Stay Visa. So it takes away from the person having to reveal to employers, to landlords, etc., what their life experience has been. And it also helps the person put things behind them. Repatriation is another way that we can help protect people and help them to heal from what they've been doing, what's been done to them rather. Repatriation is sometimes not possible in their country of origin, and so having family reunification in Australia can be an important part of healing. And some of those things are becoming more possible. The good news is that Australia does continue to look at its laws and ways that it can prevent human trafficking and slavery. Every year, the Australian government, through the Department of Home Affairs, holds what is called a roundtable on human trafficking, slavery and slavery-like conditions. And ACRAF is a member of that roundtable. And it's an opportunity for government departments and for NGOs to work together and try and see what does need to change in Australia. Progress can often be a lot slower than we'd like it to be, but nonetheless, progress has happened through those meetings. And one of the things that has come out of those meetings is that Australia now has a Modern Slavery Act. In 2018, that Act passed through the Commonwealth Parliament and it received royal assent from the Governor-General on the 10th of December. A number of NGOs were disappointed in the Act, but decided not to work against it because it was better to have something than nothing, and we can continue to advocate and work towards other things. At the moment, the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act is basically asking businesses to investigate their supply chains. If a business has an annual income threshold that is over $100 million, they do have to put in a report to the government of what they've done to investigate slavery and, if found, what they're doing to try and work against it. A lot of people would say, well, if you find slavery in a supply chain, you should just cut off the contract straight away. We wouldn't always agree with that. There's an opportunity to work with that supplier and try and have the supplier to change their behaviour. And so we as ACRAF would believe that there needs to be a period of negotiation, giving the supplier an opportunity to change and to come on board with what the right thing is. So there are things that are not in the Modern Slavery Act at Commonwealth level. It doesn't cater for any more support for victims of human trafficking and slavery. We'd like it to also include the appointment of an anti-slavery commissioner that would be able to work with businesses to support them, but also support victims. So and also we'd like to see a national compensation scheme for victims of human trafficking and slavery. because these laws are federal laws, there's no federal compensation scheme associated with those laws. At the moment, victims have to go back to state legislation and find crimes that are similar but not exactly the same. And also sometimes victims can be trafficked into a particular state, be there for a while and then moved somewhere else to another state. Therefore, they have to go to a number of jurisdictions in order to get compensation. So we do need a national scheme, particularly where judiciary and those that are working in the federal courts understand the complexities of human trafficking and slavery. Some of us from ACRAF and other NGOs are lucky enough to be in the Senate when this legislation passed the Senate, and that's actually where that picture comes from. We're very lucky that we do have some very good people in the Department of Home Affairs, and in that diagram there, Alex Hawke and this particular woman here, they both are departmental people and they worked on this legislation. And so it was great that we could be there with them and rejoice. I mentioned Father Peter O'Neill before, who's working with the situation of the Vanuatu men. He's currently the leader of the Columbans in Australia. Fuzz Kitto at the back there, Be Slavery Free. That's another NGO that we work very closely with. Be Slavery Free is actually a coalition of NGOs, and ACRAF is a member of that coalition. And then Christine is the National Executive Officer of ACRAF, and of course I'm in the front. And I'm sorry, I missed Rebecca. Rebecca's also from the Department of Home Affairs. So it was great to be there and celebrate the passing of that legislation in the Senate, and then to hear that it had gone back to the House and been passed the next day, and then that it went into royal assent by the 10th of December. While all that had been happening, earlier that year, back in June 2018, New South Wales had also passed a Modern Slavery Act in its Parliament, and it received royal assent from the Governor of New South Wales on the 21st of June 2018. That New South Wales legislation has still not been enacted. It's been orphaned, it's sitting on a shelf. After passing the legislation, when the Commonwealth also passed legislation, the New South Wales government sent it back to an inquiry. It's very unfortunate because the New South Wales legislation is far more robust. It does provide for an anti-slavery commissioner. It does provide for awareness raising. It does provide for supports for victims of human trafficking and slavery. It has a lower threshold for businesses. The threshold is $50 million a year. There does need to be some harmonisation with some things for sure. You don't want a company that's earning over the $100 million to have to report to both. And the New South Wales legislation has already been through the inquiry. They've already said, well, if they have to report to the Commonwealth, then they report to the Commonwealth, not to the state. But anyone between 50 and 100 million threshold should report to the state. The state legislation allows for penalties for companies that do not submit reports. The Commonwealth doesn't. There's a law that says they have to, but if they don't, there's no follow-up. And we know from the UK Slavery Act that only 1/3 of businesses reported in the UK, and again, there's no penalty, so there's no follow-up. So we're disappointed that the New South Wales Act hasn't been implemented, and at the moment there is a petition going around asking the government to enact without further delay. If you want to sign that petition, it's an online petition. You go to the New South Wales Parliament website, and on the side menu you'll find where you can go to petitions, and then on the next page you look for Modern Slavery Act. We need 20,000 signatures by the 3rd of November, I think it is. It's either the 1st or the 3rd of November. If we have 20,000 signatures, it must be debated in Parliament. If we don't get up to that threshold, then it probably won't have any impact. So we're really asking people to help us to get those signatures to try and have the New South Wales Act, which is groundbreaking legislation globally, to have that implemented and not sitting on a shelf as it should be. So, coming to the point of what can we do? There are a number of things that we can do. Even you sitting here today, you're doing something. You're learning about the issue. And it would be really great if you then take that information and talk to other people. People get shocked, and rightly so, because it is a shocking crime. But the more people that know about it, the more people are going to be alert to it. And therefore, there's more possibility of being able to eliminate the crime. There are various campaigns that take place at various times of the year. The whole issue of child slavery in the chocolate industry is one that we pick up regularly. We have a special campaign leading up to Easter with Easter eggs and slavery in the chocolate industry. But all through the year, we can be cautious about what chocolate we purchase. Almost 20 years ago now, a number of the big chocolate companies signed a voluntary protocol, the Harkin-Engel Protocol, that said that they would eliminate child slavery from the chocolate industry by 2005. Unfortunately, nearly 20 years later, from when they first signed the voluntary protocol, that is not a reality. So we're still trying to get people to be aware of the chocolate they're purchasing. You'll notice down low on the screen there are 3 logos: Yutz, Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. If you see one of those logos on a chocolate wrapper, there's less likelihood that that chocolate is tainted by child slavery. I say less likelihood because none of them are perfect, but they're better than nothing. You do have to look hard sometimes for those logos. Sometimes, you know how there's a fold on the wrapper of the chocolate, sometimes the logo's hidden underneath that. But most Nestle products now do carry the Yutz certification. All Hague's chocolates carry the Yutz certification. With Cadbury, only their dairy milk variety carries the Fair Trade certification. So there are some chocolates that we can buy with a free conscience, but there are some that we should be steering away from. And by not purchasing them, we're sending a message that we don't want chocolates tainted by slavery. It's the same with tea, coffee, the garments that we wear, the electronic goods that we use. We really do need to try and find out more about those products. And with the internet today, there's lots of examples of how we can do that and inform ourselves so that we can make correct choices. So moving on, a number of parishes have social justice groups, and to raise this issue in a parish social justice gathering, such as we're doing today, is another way of helping to educate people. I've brought with me today a number of these brochures that ACRAF has developed. It's a brochure that in the centre, for every month of the year, there's a suggestion of what you might do that month to try and work against human trafficking and slavery. And on the back, there is some prayers, intercessory prayers, and also a comment from Pope Francis. Unfortunately, after we printed these brochures last year, the Australian Church changed Social Justice Sunday from September back to August. So there's an error on it now, but we're still using up the copies that we've got. So that's another way. If you don't want to take one from here, there's the link to where you can find the brochure on the ACRAF website. And I think there are some copies of my hard copies of my PowerPoint presentation for you to take away if you want to, so you'll have that link. The 8th of February is the feast of St Josephine Bakhita, and Josephine Bakhita is the patron saint of those who have experienced trafficking or slavery. She is an African woman who was sold at a very young age. She went through a number of resellings until she ended up with an Italian family. She went to school with the Canossian sisters in Italy and eventually became a Canossian sister. But just a few years ago, she was named as the patron saint of those who have been trafficked or enslaved. And so we use the Feast of St Josephine Bakhita each year. Pope Francis has asked that that be a day of prayer, reflection and action. Prayer is very important. Prayer can work miracles beyond our capacity. But we also need to support our prayer, and that's where reflecting on what we might do and then actually taking that action is just as important. So especially around the 8th of February, that's a time for us to think about that. I mentioned a moment ago about shopping ethically, fashion garment. Baptist World Aid put out this document, Ethical Fashion Guide. They have in that listed all the fashion houses for Australia and New Zealand, and they have them graded from A down to F. And issues that they look at in that grading are to do with whether or not there's forced labour, whether or not workers are being paid a just living wage, the conditions, work conditions, if their accommodation is provided for the workers, what is that level of accommodation, do they have freedom, etc. So every fashion house is ranked from A through to F. This document has been coming out for a number of years now. They haven't had one this year. 2019 is the most recent one. And when you go back and look at the first one and now look at this one, a number of companies have increased their grades and improved on what they've been doing. So one of the things that we as ACRAF say to people is take that guide, have a look at it. If you've got clothing that you particularly like to come from a particular fashion house, have a look at their grade. If they've got a good grade, we need to acknowledge the good things that people are doing. Write them a letter and say thank you and how pleased you are at what they're doing in terms of this issue. If the clothing that you purchase is normally from a company that hasn't performed so well, write to them, acknowledge that you like their clothing, you're disappointed that they didn't do so well in this grade, and are they doing something to try and improve that? We can be agents for change in very small ways. Writing one letter doesn't take a lot of time, but it can have a big impact. So again, while there are copies of this over there, there's also the link on the slide there of where you can find that online. And they do have one that is a electronics guide too. In the electronics guide, no company received an A grade. So there's a lot of work to be done in the electronics area. But as we said, there is improvement that's happening, but we need to keep them at it. Raising funds for NGOs that are working in this area is another way that people can become partners and support the work that is being done. In some of our earlier years, ACRAF was in receipt of government funding, but we haven't received government funding for a number of years now, and so we rely entirely on donations. One of the things when we were receiving government funding, we'd have to put in a report every 6 months as to how we'd use that money. And the comment that kept coming back to us was they were surprised at how much we did with so little. And so, you know, we can assure you that any donations we receive, we do take it very seriously that we have to use that money responsibly to support victims and to support our advocacy work. We currently have about 120-30 members throughout Australia, and all but 5 of those are volunteers. So there's not a lot of money going into overheads. A lot of the money is being used for the purpose that it was donated for. So at that point, I'd just like to take a pause for a few moments. Before I show the final slide, there may be some comments or questions. I know you've had a lot of confronting information thrown at you this afternoon, so if anyone would like to ask a question or express a comment, now would be the time.
I'm just wondering if there's anything to suggest that government agencies or officials are aware of things that may be happening but turn a blind eye.
I wouldn't say that they completely turn a blind eye. I think that many of our government agencies have been very engaged in this work, particularly through the roundtable. Here in Sydney, every second month there is a Sydney Trafficking Response Network meeting, and government agencies come to that. I guess it's just that things happen very slowly. And you know, sometimes there are other priorities that they might see as needing more resources than what this area does. I think the fact that there aren't a huge number of convictions doesn't help our case. The AFP are really trying hard to get more convictions, but it's that building up trust with the victims and helping them to realise that they're not going to be further exploited when they go to law enforcement. That by going to law enforcement, things will happen, even if it takes a long time. We worked with one person in Queensland who had experienced great exploitation, great trauma, and because of that, she wasn't able mentally to take part in a process to convict her trafficker, therefore couldn't stay on the Support for Trafficked People program. It took 9 years before we could get permanent residency for her in Australia in a safe situation. So things happen very slowly, and it can be discouraging, but we have to say, you know, keep working. We kept going back to Parliament. Most years, ACRAF has a week in federal Parliament where we make appointments individually with members and ministers of the government and present our cases and so on. Now, we weren't able to do that this year because of COVID, but instead we've been holding online Zoom meetings for them. So our advocacy is concentrated in 1 week but goes over the whole year. We just keep it before them. And we do get results in the long run, and so do other NGOs too that are working in this space. But as I said before, not as quickly as we'd like to, you know.
I'm just wondering whether employer associations and trade unions are involved in this issue.
Yes, they are, definitely. And they're part of, in Sydney, they're part of the Sydney Trafficking Response Network. They're members of the roundtable, and they certainly are involved in this area, yes. Mm.
This is a question arising very much out of my ignorance. When people are brought into Australia to work on a visa which allows them to work, is the employer traceable when they come into Australia, when they pass customs? Is there some kind of system set up whereby the place where they are employed can be traced and checked on later on to see how things are going? Or is it much more free-for-all than that?
Great, that's a great question and something I perhaps should have commented on earlier. One of the problems and one of the things we would have liked to have seen in the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act is licensing of labour hire firms, because a number of the labour hire firms just act via a mobile phone. That's their address, and that's through that they're contacting people and bringing them into Australia. And you know, some of the it's not the actual farmers in the agricultural area that are exploiting the people through not paying them salaries and so on. It's the labour hire firms who are not passing on the payments to the workers, because with the labour hire firms bringing them in, they're the ones responsible for paying them. We know of cases where workers have been given their salaries and have been taken straight down to the ATM and forced to draw that money out and hand it back. And the reason they're paid in the first place is so that there would be a paper trail, so that the person responsible for paying them has something to say, well, I did pay them. So, you know, labour hire companies, those that are exploiting others, they use all kinds of means to get around the legislation. And so we're saying there needs to be licensing of labour hire firms throughout Australia. Queensland now does have a scheme, and Victoria has a scheme, but there's room for improvement in those, and we need something that's national. Not different because you cross over an imaginary line on the land. We say labour hire firms often Phoenix change their mobile phone number so that they can't be traced.
If I go to a restaurant and I'm served by a girl from Southeast Asia of 18 years old, from what you said, I wonder now whether she is being paid properly, whether she's free or not.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything I can do just as a patron in a restaurant to check or have some kind of information about what's going on?
It's a difficult situation because our inclination is we want to try and help these people. There are some indicators that you can look at. They may not indicate human trafficking and slavery, but they may. For example, if somebody is looking very despondent, doesn't have a very good flow of the language, seems to be timid and scared, they could be indicators that there is a problem. But our response, we have to be very careful that we don't impact on the safety of that person, because people who've been trafficked are watched very carefully by their employers. I'd say that in most restaurants, people who have been trafficked are not the ones that are out there serving on the tables. They're the ones back working in the kitchen where they can't be seen. One day, this is quite a few years ago now, I was walking along the streets of Sydney, just near Dimmicks, and there were a number of people walking around with placards, massage here, etc., and, come and have a massage, etc. But over near Dimmicks' window, there was a woman who had her head down, was holding the sign up, and you could tell that she just didn't feel comfortable in what she was doing. Had I gone up to her and said something, she could have been watched by the people who dropped her there and so on, and she could have been in more trouble later in the day. Fortunately, I was on my way to a meeting, the Sydney Trafficking Response Network meeting, and there was an Australian Federal Police officer there. So I mentioned where the woman was and if they were in that area that they might keep an eye and see whether or not there was anything suspicious going on. It's far better to do things quietly and subtly because we don't know what harm will come. Many of these people are told that if they escape, their families back home will be harmed, they'll be harmed, they can be drugged into compliance at times. So always the safety of the person who's been trafficked or enslaved is the first priority, and trying to find other ways to be able to get support for them. I don't know whether that entirely answers the question. It still leaves us helpless in some situations, doesn't it?
So when you cited that 40 million that's a worldwide figure, Are there any figures relating to Australia specifically?
Only those figures I gave from the Australian Federal Police. They're the only accurate figures we have, but as we say, that's just the tip of the iceberg because that's only the people who've talked to the Australian Federal Police. I mentioned earlier Anti-Slavery Australia. We work very closely with Anti-Slavery Australia. They're a pro bono, they offer pro bono legal services for people who've been trafficked, and they're situated within the University of Technology in Sydney. And of their clients, and they usually have 70 to 80 clients on their books at one time, not all of their clients would be people who've spoken to the Australian Federal Police. So NGOs do have their own statistics, but it's hard to know sometimes whether there's doubling up in some of that because, like for example, Anti-Slavery Australia asks us sometimes, and organisations in Victoria asks ACRAF, if we can support some of their victims. So a person might be linking with a number of NGOs depending on skills. ACRAF is not able to provide client services, but we are able to provide pastoral services, taking the person out for a cup of coffee or supporting them when they go to a medical appointment, things like that. So it's very difficult because you have to protect the identity of these people. It's very difficult to see where is the double up across NGOs and what is the real number in Australia. So that's why the Australian Federal Police statistics are the only real statistics that we have. Okay, any other questions?
I was recently, the end of last year, my friend and I found a girl in our own suburb who had been there for 6 years as a housekeeper and had never been paid from overseas. And it was through the federal police that she was removed from the house and protected and went back to her family, and I think the court case is coming up at the end of the year.
Right, yes. Unfortunately, the process is so long and it can be re-traumatising for the person, having to live through it all, having to be cross-examined in court.
And also, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing, saying something about them, because their life might be worse if they're sent back home, you know.
Yes.
But she was never paid. She came over for 2 years and was here for 6 years, and wasn't allowed out of the house.
Yes.
Did the housework. Only that we're walking past and she spoke to us that
Yes. Yeah.
the neighbours knew nothing about her or anything.
No, it's unfortunately, and that's why there was a federal inquiry into human trafficking and slavery in Australia, and the report that they put out was hidden in plain sight.
Yes.
You know,
and I just hope that she'll get some compensation.
Yes, yeah.
Because, as you're saying, often they don't get any compensation.
That's right.
Because the people can't give it.
That's right. And even the whole thing about going back to their own country, many of the victims do want to go home, and therefore it's important to give them support. Now, one of the things that through religious congregations, especially international groups, we often have members in different countries, and we're able to get someone in the home country to support the person when they arrive home, so that we can, try and prevent the situation of them being re-trafficked again. So that's why international networks are just as important as local networks.
Yes.
And we do actually have what's called Talitha Kum, Little Girl Arise. It's a network that's been set up by the Union of Superiors General of Women's Congregations. We call it the International Network of Consecrated Life Against Trafficking in Persons. And we work through that group in order to help with repatriation back to countries of origin, so that there are sisters in those countries that will greet the person at the airport and help them when they get home. It's really important, the ongoing support for them, because the trauma stays with them for a long, long time. And while ever they're in trauma, they're vulnerable. And re-trafficking can easily happen. And there have been cases where people have been re-trafficked, lots of them. So,
Thank you. That's
thank
really,
you.
really interesting.
Okay, well, I might just move on to the final slide for this afternoon. And throughout the presentation, we've heard words of Jesus, we've heard about civil law, we've heard words of Pope Francis, but there's also one of the modern prophets of the 20th century that has some very good words for us, and I would hope that we can take them to heart. And they are words of Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Let's not be silent. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.